Yes, we could go ahead and get started. So, good morning, everybody. You're seeing Liz, I think. That's who is in the center of my screen. Liz Vincent is one of the people who helps coordinate our museum minion at Beth Yeshurun. And since right now, because of the virus, we're not gathering. We are getting groups of people. In fact, we're going to open up to more people for the main service if you'd like to sign up to come. But most of the people are watching online. The Museum Minion is doing a Zoom service instead of a regular live stream service, which means people can interact a little more and you get to see everybody's face. And you don't get to see that even in the real service because everybody's face is covered with a mask. So, so anyway, Liz is going to tell you a little about the Museum Minion. It's a smaller group of people. You get to know everybody, and it's a very welcoming group.
Okay. Well, good morning, and it's good to, I guess good to see everybody here. Yes, my name is Elizabeth Vincent. I am a member of the Museum Minion, which is just one of the 3 services that goes on at Beth Yeshurun on Shabbat. I'm also on the Board of Trustees, so, but the Museum Minion is a small group of people, so you get to know each other. It's very community oriented. We are a lay-led, which means that the members lead services ourselves. So people have an opportunity to get involved. Some of our rabbis do come and they give a devar, they give a sermon sometimes, but a lot of times it's by our members. They chant Torah, they do half Torah, lead the services. So it's really, really nice. And we're traditional. The traditional service is no musical accompaniment. And right now we are on Zoom, so it's nice because you still get to see people's faces, and you still feel part of the minion. When it wasn't COVID, we would have Shabbat lunches once a month and together a potluck, and we had potluck dinners every other month. And one of the nice things too is we celebrate with each other for different life cycle events. So I will be getting all of your emails. Hopefully that's okay. And that way I can send you an email and a link to the Zoom service. It is also on the website. And one of the other things that we've been doing too on Saturday nights is doing Havdalah. And Havdalah ends Shabbat as we are entering into the new week. And it's also a really nice way of, having a ritual. It's very short, but then you still get to see people. And it's just a beautiful service. Rabbi Morgan and Cantor Dorf are there on a weekly basis. And so it is very nice. And like I said, you get to know people. And I think that's really important. It gets to feel more comfortable as you're embarking on something that's new. So I look forward to seeing all your faces, and you'll have my email address if you have any questions. So, so hope to see you on Shabbat. Okay, thank you very much.
Great, thanks, Liz. So it's good that she is on the class today because we're going to be talking about prayer services at Beth Yeshurun. And so let's take a look at those. I don't know if you all got the handouts, but there's a link. We're going to put a link to the handout in the chat box. So you'll see at the bottom of your screen in the center is a little chat thing that, and a little chat balloon. And Jennifer will put the link to the chat, to the handout in the chat box there eventually. But I'm going to pull it up and share a screen and show you the handout. And okay, here we go. There, everybody can see that, right? So so here's my introduction to Jewish prayers, and this is kind of a roadmap to help you get oriented to what's going on. Some of this may actually be things that Jewish people who come to services regularly don't necessarily know. So you're going to start learning things that some Jewish people don't know, even if they come to services. Okay, so the first thing is the prayer book in Hebrew is called a Siddur, S-I-D-D-U-R in English. And Siddur comes from the Hebrew word for order, because the prayer book is sort of the order of the prayers when we come together to pray as a community. So we'll talk about the prayer book as a Siddur. And the second thing to know about Jewish community prayers is there is this conflict between two goals of prayer, particularly prayer when you're praying in a community. One is, and they're kind of captured with two Hebrew words that sound similar. One is called keva, which means fixed. So you have a fixed liturgy, a fixed set of prayers that are found in the prayer book. And the other Hebrew word is kavanah, which means intention. And that means that you want to pray something that you actually feel. You want to have intention when you pray. The words that you say, you want to have some meaning to them. But if you're using fixed prayers that somebody else wrote, how do you have intention? How do you put your own feeling into those prayers? And that creates this tension that's often described in Jewish discussions about Jewish prayer, the tension between keva and kavanah, or fixed prayers and praying with intention. And that's one of the things that I'll talk about in the class today. So, so the fixed prayers, the word for prayer in English for worship services is called liturgy. And Psalms, the book of Psalms, is the earliest known Jewish prayer book. So if you're familiar with the Bible, the book of Psalms, it contains 150 prayer poems, written, many of them, most of them in First Temple times. So the time when the first temple stood, the temple built by King Solomon and destroyed by the Babylonians in 586 before the Common Era. So many of these Psalms were written during that time. They're the earliest prayer poems that we have recorded for the Jewish people. And they express all kinds of different emotions, joy and happiness, thanksgiving, sorrow and regret, fear, danger, as seeking God's protection and requests from God. All different kinds of emotions are expressed in this 150 poem book. Most Jewish prayers are kind of poetry, and I don't know about you, but I am poetry challenged. Poetry doesn't come easy to me. It's hard for me to understand what a poet is trying to say. I have to stop and think about it a lot. And even then, it helps if I had somebody who knows the poet and can help me get through it. There are books about Jewish prayer that kind of unpack the poetry for you, but what I want to say first is, if you're having difficulty understanding the prayers, even when you read the English translation, that's normal. Because it's poetry, it's filled with a lot of metaphors and images, and you do have to think about it. So, one thing you can do is focus on a different prayer or a couple prayers every week, and try and unpack them and figure out what they mean. And over the several weeks and months, you'll get to know a lot of the prayers, and they'll become much more meaningful to you over time. That's just one of the things. One of the reasons why poetry is helpful in prayers is most of them are talking about God. And as we're going to talk about in a couple of weeks, when we start talking about God directly, God is a concept that a lot of people don't easily understand. God doesn't have a body, doesn't have a form, exists out of the space-time continuum. How do you describe that being in English or in any language when our language is designed to describe things that exist in the physical world? God doesn't exist in the physical world. So you necessarily have to have metaphors, and that necessarily means that it won't be necessarily so easy to understand what the prayers are trying to say. We do have a translation. So another thing is that all the prayers, our movement is the conservative movement, and one of the things we broke away from the Reform movement. Well, you should give a little bit of history about this. So before the Enlightenment period, before science and the modern world, everybody was just Jewish. When the science and the modern world hit, Christianity, Judaism, and Islam, everybody had to react to science to help our religions meet and understand the world the way we now, science was telling us the way the world is. The Reform movement, in response to the Enlightenment, was very radical originally, and they decided, and by the way, they got this idea from Luther. So those of you who came from the Christian world, Martin Luther attacked the Catholic Church, saying, why are we praying in Latin? Nobody understands Latin. It's a dead language. We should pray in a language we understand, which is a really powerful argument. If you're talking to God, you should know what you're saying, and therefore speak in the language you understand. So the Lutherans were the first to translate the Christian prayers into the local language. And the Reform movement copied that approach and decided to abandon a lot of the Hebrew prayers and just translate things into English. They also shortened the prayer service because many Protestant churches only have 1 hour services on Sundays, and the Jewish prayer service on Saturday is about 2.5 hours long if you do the whole service. So they chopped out all kinds of stuff. They cut it down to make it fit the 1 hour time period. They added musical accompaniment because many churches had organs. Jews had never had musical accompaniment, at least for 2,000 years. But the Reform movement felt they wanted to be more like the churches of their neighbors, so they added musical instruments. So all these changes they made to the prayer services to sort of meet the modern times. Our movement, the conservative movement, reacted against the Reform movement, saying, you changed too much, you were too radical. We argued specifically that we should continue to pray in Hebrew because that's what Jews have done for centuries. And if you're a Frenchman, for instance, or a German, and you're praying in French or in German, the language, and then you go to a different country, you won't know what they're saying because you don't speak that language. But if we all pray in Hebrew, Jews can go anywhere in the world and they'll be able to open a prayer book and they'll know what people are praying. And besides which, that was the language that our ancestors prayed in for thousands of years. And translating is always challenging. How do you translate from one language to another? So we said we have to keep the Hebrew language in the prayers. And the second thing we did was we said we can't chop it down to fit the 1 hour time slot. We're going to keep the traditional service structure the way it was. So this class today is going to talk about that issue, right? What is that structure? And how do you deal with the fact that the language is still in Hebrew? One concession our movement did make was we decided to put an English translation or the translation into the local language on a facing page. So we kept the Hebrew on one side, but we put the English or other language on the other side so you could at least read the language in the language you understand, and you understand what the prayer is about. Even if it's not a perfect translation, at least it tells you what the prayer is about. It gives you some idea of what it is you're praying. Because we did agree with Martin Luther that if you're talking to God, you should know what you're saying and not just mouthing a bunch of syllables. So, so that was our compromise. But we wanted to keep the prayers in the original Hebrew language. Now, as I said, translating, anybody who's ever tried to translate anything from one language to another knows that you lose something in translation necessarily. The way the language sounds, it's very hard to capture the sound. Like if it's alliteration, it captures certain consonants that repeat over and over again or make a certain meter in the poetry. It's hard to translate into a different language and keep that meter, keep that sound, the sound of it. It's hard to precisely translate some words. And then Hebrew prayers are frequently very cleverly based on little snippets of words from the Bible or snippets of rabbinic interpretations of the Bible. And how do you translate those in a way that they capture that it reminds you of that snippet from the Bible? So translation is necessarily difficult. One of the advantages, oh, I didn't bring up a page. The next time we talk about prayers, we're going to go into more detail about certain parts of the prayer service and another class. And when I do that, I'll show you a page from our new prayer book, the new prayer book our movement has produced called Lev Shalem, and it has a commentary in the margins, and that helps to explain a lot about what's going on, what the sources of the prayer were from the Bible or commentaries, and why things are there the way they are. So that helps, besides having the translation, it's also a commentary to help explain the prayers. Okay, so let's see, what else do I want to say here? The final thing about having using the language of the prayer book is that they were written by very, very clever people. Most of us are not wordsmiths. Most of us are not poets. Most of us are not like Shakespeare in the English language, right? And there's something about hearing Shakespeare's plays where he just is so brilliant in how he turns a phrase in English and how he uses the language. Well, the Hebrew prayer poems were written by people like Shakespeare who were just immersed in the Hebrew language and in Bible and so on, and were very clever in how they use the Hebrew language. It's hard to reproduce that. But again, if you're like me and you go to hear a Shakespeare play today, it takes me a long time to get used to the language, because even though it's English, it's Elizabethan English. It's English from several centuries ago, and the language has changed in the centuries. And so for me to understand what they're saying is hard. And even once I figure out it's Elizabethan English, again, Shakespeare played with words, and you have to pause and think about how he did that to sort of really understand the beauty of his words, right? That's the problem. So all those problems of translation happen in Hebrew prayers as well, but we're praying with words that were written by people who were pretty smart. And if we can take the time to unpack what they're saying, there makes it really more interesting. Okay, so we talked a little about Hebrew and English and why we continue to pray in Hebrew. The last question I'm going to ask before I go on a little detour is why do we need a prayer book at all? Why shouldn't we just be able to pray whenever we want to and use our own words? And the answer to that is you can. You can pray anytime you want to, and you can let's put speaker view. Oh, you know what? For some reason, I'm not the speaker. Why is that? People can hear me, yes?
Yes, you can.
Yes, that's good. Okay. And is my picture in the front of you, in the middle of your screen, or is somebody else's picture in the middle of the screen?
You're in the middle of my screen.
Okay. Yeah, so it's something weird with my phone. Oh, there we go. Yeah, now I'm spotlighted. Okay. What was I going to say? Why not just use your own words? So the answer is you can use your own words, and you can pray anytime you want to, and Judaism certainly encourages that. You know, if you're having, getting ready for a final exam or some test or some big interview or something, and you want to pray, by all means pray, use your own words. There's nothing wrong with that. The prayer book is designed for when Jews want to come together as a community to pray. And Judaism is a religion of a community. And so we do want to get together on a regular basis to pray together as a group. There's a certain power to doing that. When you're coming together to pray as a community, you get reinforcement from that community. Also, I'm not very good at exercising. Nowadays, the only exercise I get is when Diane and I go out for a walk. And that's because we both say we have to do this, right? And a great way to exercise is to have an exercise partner that you're responsible to, so that you go out on a regular basis. You can't just stay in bed because this other person's expecting you to be at the gym to exercise. And it's the same thing with community prayer. If you don't have the community coming together at a regular time, expecting you to be there, you may not ever do it, right? The idea that you're doing it as a community kind of gets you in the habit of praying regularly. But once you come together to pray, if you're all saying your own thing, it's chaos in the room. So once you're in a community, you need to have words that everybody agrees to, and that's where the prayer book comes in, to focus people on a fixed set of prayers. And again, I'm about to describe what that is after I take you on a historical detour. The historical detour is necessary to explain the structure. Okay, so now let's talk about the historical detour. So I mentioned that the book of Psalms, the 150 prayer poems in the Bible, were the original prayer book of the Jewish people. They were sung the way we understand it today, Bible scholars today piecing together material from archaeology and early sources. These Psalms were sung by a Levite choir. There was like a professional choir of Levites, one of the tribes of Israel. And they were trained singers. And again, if analogizing from today, I would assume that each, like a choir today, there were different musical parts for each person of the choir. Some people had higher voices, lower voices. One would do the melody, somebody would do harmony, right? It was a very intricate performance. And in addition to that, before the temple was destroyed, we did sing prayers to musical accompaniment. And there was a Levite orchestra. So well, not every, yes, some didn't know how to sing. That's true. It was this, it was from the tribe of Levi, but only the ones who could sing were the ones in the choir. Trust me, they didn't have the people with terrible voices singing in the choir. Then they also had specialized Levites who were musicians who would play the instruments, trumpets, stringed instruments, drums, and so on. So there was a whole orchestra that played musical accompaniment to this choir. It was probably very, very dramatic. Now, what did they do? So there were two basic kinds of sacrifices that were offered in the temple in Jerusalem, right? In those days, before the Common Era, like 2,000, 3,000 years ago, if you were a pagan, yeah, I'll talk about Shuckling. If you were a pagan, you would go to the temple of the god you wanted to pray to, right? And somebody would offer a sacrifice to that god. That's just how people thought about approaching gods in those days. You wouldn't come to a temple without bringing a gift to the god. And the gift was an animal that was slaughtered and burnt, right? And the smoke would supposedly go up to heaven. Now that's hard for us to understand because we're not in that world anymore. But if you lived in that world, it was like everybody thought the world was flat. And if you tried to tell them it was round, they'd think you were crazy. The same thing with sacrifices. If everybody just assumed if you went to visit your God, you had to bring a gift. And if you didn't bring a gift, they thought you were nuts. So that's just how things were done. So you had the temple in Jerusalem, there would be sacrifices, and then these sacrifices would be offered to the accompaniment of the choir and the orchestra. So as I said, there's two kinds of sacrifices. The first thing that would happen when the temple opened for business in the morning, the sun comes up, the Levites open the gates, they start welcoming people in. The very first sacrifice brought by the Cohen, the priest, was the sacrifice on behalf of all of the Israelites. And that's mentioned in the Bible. It's described in the Bible. It was a certain animal offering. It was kind of a way of saying, hello, God, the Jewish people are here again. We're ready to worship you, right? So that was the daily offering in the morning. And then in the afternoon, the priest would offer another sacrifice on behalf of all the Israelites, and that was the afternoon sacrifice. And then in between, there would be a constant stream of individual people coming to Jerusalem and the Temple Mount, and they would be bringing their own personal sacrifices. So let me give an example. Suppose you live in Tel Aviv, and that's on the coast in Israel. It's a modern city, so it didn't exist back then, but whatever. You live in Tel Aviv, and you just got a big promotion. You're now the head of a department at IBM. There is an IBM office in Tel Aviv. It's a big one. So you got a big promotion. Now the head of a big department at IBM in Tel Aviv, and it's a great thing. And you want to give thanks to God. So you would go on a pilgrimage to Jerusalem. You would go up the steps to the Temple Mount. And inside, there would be vendors who would be selling animals that were blemish-free and perfect and available to use as sacrifices. So first, you'd have to change your money, by the way. So for those who read the Christian Bible and read about the money changers, they were money changers because people could be coming from other countries, or even if they were coming from outside of Jerusalem, they'd be using Roman coins. And Roman coins always had the stamp of the emperor's face on them. And you can't bring images into the temple because they're considered idolatry. So you had to change your secular money for temple money. That's what the money exchangers were there for, right? Just like if you go to a foreign country today and you bring your dollars, you have to change them for francs if you're going to France, or marks if you're going to Germany. So you go to the temple and you change your money for temple money. And then you would use that money to buy an animal, and you'd give it to the priest. And now I'm going to use my imagination a little bit. We don't know exactly how this worked, so I'm going to embellish it with my imagination. And the priest would greet you at the gate, and he'd ask you what you're here for. And you would say, I'm here because I got this promotion at IBM, and I'm now got this big raise, and I want to give thanks to God. And the priest would take out his 150-page loose leaf notebook of the Psalms, right? And he'd flip through the Psalms to find a Psalm of Thanksgiving, and he'd pull it out, and he'd say, here is the words, take this song and give it to the Levite orchestra. And by the way, here is the sheet of music. Give this, the first one's going to the Levite Choir, and the music is going to go to the Levite orchestra. So the orchestra will play the music, the choir will sing the psalm, and you will bring your sacrifice over to the priest over there at the altar, right? So then the animal is offered while the choir is singing and the band is playing the music. And you can imagine, if you use your imagination, how dramatic that must have been for somebody to feel that they were in God's presence in this big, magnificent open space of the Temple Mount, hearing the music, singing the songs, watching the animal sacrifice, and feeling like, wow, I'm really giving thanks to God, okay? And there's a constant stream of individuals coming from all over the world, Jews coming from all over the world, either giving thanks to God or asking God for something or seeking God's forgiveness for some mistake they might have made, whatever it was, as constant stream of individual sacrifices that came in between the public offering at the beginning and the public offering sometime in the afternoon. And then as the sun would start to sink slowly into the west, the last few people would come in with their individual sacrifices, and the temple gates were closed, the temple would be cleaned, and everybody would go to sleep for the night. Okay, that is my historical segue, right? So that's the history of Jewish prayer. Now, why is that relevant today? Let me see, first of all, if there's any chats here. Okay, Shuckling I'll explain a little bit later, hopefully, so try and remind me. Let me go back to my, okay. So that's that's number 5 over here, communal worship, the temple and history of synagogue music, right? Oh, so today we don't have a Levite choir and a Levite orchestra, but we do have Jews who are trained to sing Jewish prayers, and those people are called cantors. So we have Cantor Mayer Finkelstein, who does have a beautiful voice if you've heard him sing. We wanted to make sure, Jews in every community want to make sure that the person who leads the service can sing. You know, they don't want somebody who will sing out of tune. It doesn't sound good when you're leading a service that way. But some have better voices than others, you know, and so some people become celebrity cantors. We're very fortunate we have a celebrity cantor, Mayer Finkelstein. Not only is his voice very beautiful, he's also a composer, and he composes new musical pieces to accompany the prayers in our prayer book. So he's Jews all over the world are singing many of his musical compositions when they do their services. The other term for a cantor here is shots. You can see this word shots over here. That is an abbreviation for the Hebrew word shaliach tzibur. Shaliach means messenger, and tzibur means public. So the messenger for the public is the prayer leader, and that's abbreviated to shots. The rabbi typically originally did not have a big role in the prayer service in synagogues. That came as a result of priests and ministers in churches giving sermons and so on. Rabbis originally didn't give sermons on a regular basis in a synagogue. They were there to answer questions. If there was like a mistake in the Torah, can you still read from that Torah scroll? Or if it's a particular day of the week, what is the order of the prayers for that day? If there was a question of Jewish law about the service, they would be asked a question. But otherwise, they were kind of in the background. But when Jews were living next door to Christians in their churches, and the ministers and priests would be giving sermons, the rabbi soon was called upon to do a similar thing. So now rabbis give sermons. They don't necessarily have to lead the service, but they often also call out the page numbers. Very complicated. Anyway, so that's kind of that. So let's talk about the services. So understanding the history of how Jewish prayer developed, so I need to throw in one other thing. So I described what happened in the temple in Jerusalem, but in the year 70, the second temple was destroyed by the Romans. And that was a cataclysmic event for the Jewish people. We no longer could bring sacrifices, so the center of our national prayer service was destroyed. What do we do? And we had a group of founding fathers. I'm going to actually do a lunch and learn on this Friday. A group of founding fathers of what became Judaism after the temple was destroyed, who kind of embellished Jewish life to function without a temple. And one of the major things they did was create the prayer structures that we use today. And they didn't create things out of whole cloth. They took Jewish tradition and they embellished it and developed it with structures that would replace what was done before, but in a way that was organic, sort of fit with what came before. So I mentioned that there were two sacrifices brought by the community, right? Brought for the community by the priest. The first one in the early morning, the first thing the temple would open, a community offering, and then again a community offering in the afternoon. And so what the rabbis did for that was they created a set of blessings, which they called the Amidah. That's this word over here, Amidah, which means standing prayer. And this Amidah would replace that community sacrifice. And so now we do this Amidah. Originally, we did it twice a day, once in the morning when the morning sacrifice would have been brought, and once in the afternoon when the afternoon community sacrifice was brought. This Amidah replaced the temple sacrifice, the community sacrifice. So the morning prayer is called Shacharit, and Shacharit comes from the Hebrew word Shachar, which means dawn, when the sun comes up. So the morning service is called Shacharit, and we would do a Shacharit Amidah, the Amidah, the standing prayer in the morning service. And the afternoon service came to be called Mincha. So this Mincha service replaced the community offering in the afternoon. So you'd have a Mincha Amidah. And then there's a passage in Deuteronomy, which we'll look at in a later week, called the Shema, which says, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one." Shema, in Hebrew, it's Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. And it's followed by a sentence that is very well known in Christian world, V'ahavta et Adonai Elohecha, b'chol levavcha, u'v'chol nafshecha, u'v'chol me'odecha. You will love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and all your strength. Right? It's known because Jesus quoted that verse in 4 places in the Gospels. So this paragraph that starts with, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one, and you should love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and all your strength," is found at the beginning of the book of Deuteronomy. And it says you should speak these words when you lie down and when you rise up. And so we took that literally, and we said, okay, this paragraph from Deuteronomy, we should say twice a day, once in the evening when we lie down, and once in the morning when we wake up. And then we added two other paragraphs from the Torah, one from Deuteronomy and one from the book of Numbers. And we attached those two paragraphs to the first paragraph. And we said, now this unit of passages from the Bible we'll say twice a day. And then the rabbis, after the temple was destroyed, added some blessings before and after what we call the Shema, this unit of biblical passages. Two blessings before the unit, and at least one, and in the evening, two blessings after. And again, I'll talk about this as a separate topic in a later class, the Shema and its blessings. But that unit then was recited twice every day, in the morning when we wake up, and in the evening at night before we go to sleep. So those two things became the basic building blocks of Jewish communal prayer. The Amidah, which was said in the morning and the afternoon, and the Shema, which was said in the morning and at night. The evening service, by the way, was called Ma'ariv, from the word Erev, which means evening. So then the third stage of development of Jewish prayer was Jews were coming together to do the Shema at night, and at some point it was decided that it wasn't really a community service unless we did an Amidah as well. And so they added to the Shema at night another Amidah, the evening Amidah. So now we're doing the Amidah 3 times a day, Shacharit, Mincha, and Mariv. And we do the Shema on 2 of those occasions, at Shacharit and Mariv. So the morning service, the Shacharit service, starts with the Shema, and then we do an Amidah. The afternoon service is just an Amidah, and the evening service starts with the Shema, and then we do an Amidah. And finally, there's this Musaf service. Musaf just means additional. And so it says again in the Bible that besides the community offering in the morning and the afternoon, on holidays, on the Sabbath, festivals, and the new month, an extra sacrifice was brought on behalf of all the Jewish people. And that extra sacrifice got the name extra sacrifice, which in Hebrew is Musaf. And so to fit this extra community sacrifice that was offered, we do a Musaf Amidah, right? An extra Amidah, and it's attached to the Shacharit service. So we do on a festival, Shabbat, and festivals, we do Shacharit, and then we do Musaf, which is mostly just another Amidah. So that creates this building block, which you can see over here. I'm gonna condense this down here so I can show the, okay. So here's the chart. So the daily service on the left column, Shacharit, Musaf, the extra service on Shabbat and festivals, Mincha, the afternoon service, and Mariv, the evening. Some preliminary prayers are done in the morning. We'll maybe talk about this another time. There's some preliminary prayers here. There's no preliminary prayers for Musaf. Just this one psalm is recited as a preliminary prayer for Mincha. And there's one verse that's recited as a preliminary for Mariv. And then comes the Shema in Shacharit. You see the Shema with its blessings. And in the evening service, the Shema with its blessings. And there's no Shema in Musaf and no Shema in Mincha. And then the Amidah, which during a weekday is a set of 19 blessings, and on the Sabbath is only 7. The same thing happens for Musaf, same thing for Mincha, and the same thing for Mariv, right? There's an Amidah at every community service. And then there are some closing prayers, usually Aleinu and some other stuff. And then also the last thing is we added a Torah service. So we read from the 5 books of Moses, from the scrolls, In the mornings on Mondays, Thursdays, and Shabbat, and festivals. And in the afternoon, only on Shabbat and Yom Kippur. And in the evening, we read the Torah only on Simchat Torah, the holiday we just celebrated. Okay, so that's the chart. Hopefully that all makes sense. I'm going to pause here for a second and answer questions if you have questions so far. Shuckling. So you may see that particularly when Jews are praying silently the Amidah, the individual Amidah, they kind of shuckle. This is called shuckling, when they kind of wave back and forth like this while they're standing. It's a standing prayer, so you're standing up, you're kind of moving back and forth. That's called in Yiddish shuckling. So what is that about? There's two explanations for that. I kind of like both of them. One of them is there's an expression, I believe it's from Proverbs, that the soul of man is like a flame of God. Ner Adonai Nishmat Adam. And so you are kind of you're flickering like a flame on a candle while you're praying to God. So you're kind of in your soul space, as it were, flickering and reflecting God's essence, right? Ner Adonai Nishmat Adam, the flame of God is the soul of a human. So there's kind of that spiritual aspect to shuckling. But then there's a more practical aspect, which is that if you actually do this, which I do sometimes, it's kind of like a physical mantra. It kind of gets you into a meditative state where you're able to focus on what you're thinking about, all right? It's kind of like, instead of sitting perfectly still, if you do a little bit of a rocking motion, it kind of gets you into this spiritual state also. So those are two reasons why people do this thing called shuckling. Are there any other questions about prayer so far? So let me go back to the chart then. We can think about questions that you might have. So I'm trying to give you an idea of the roadmap of how the prayer book got put together. So you've got a prayer book that has a morning, an afternoon, and an evening service. And in the morning, you can expect to see the Shema and its blessings, and then an Amidah. The afternoon service, you see just an Amidah. And in the evening, you see the Shema and Amidah again. Now, a few of the physical trappings of prayer in a community. So kippah is the Hebrew word for the prayer thing that you put on top of your head. This one is a knitted kippah, but they can be made out of any kind of material, velvet, cloth, or crocheted. They come in all different colors. There's no particular reason for that. There are some general rules, which are only generalities. They're not always true. Generally speaking, if you see somebody wearing a black velvet kippah, that often means they're from a very Orthodox group. The very Orthodox group typically wear black velvet kippahs. I like to wear a black velvet kippah that has a Jewish star in the middle with a golden Jewish star in the middle. I don't know, I just like it. Doesn't mean I'm ultra Orthodox for sure. But that's one thing. Another thing is the knitted kippah like this is frequently in Israel a symbol of a sort of the religious Zionist movement, but doesn't necessarily have to be. Many people wear knitted kippahs, and is not necessarily a religious Zionist statement. Again, this here doesn't mean that I'm part of the religious Zionist movement. I just like this kippah also. Who wears a kippah? This comes from the Eastern custom of pious people, or people who are religious, or people who want to express reverence for a place, of covering their hair. Covering their hair was a sign of reverence. And so just like if you go to a mosque, they ask you to take your shoes off before you go into the mosque, because again, in the ancient Near East, if you went into a holy place, you would take your shoes off Remember Moses at the burning bush is God tells Moses to take his shoes off because he's standing in a holy place, right? That's clearly a Middle Eastern thing. So also in the Middle East, it was customary to show reverence by covering your hair. And so we ask even non-Jews to cover their head when they come into a synagogue, just as a sign of reverence for the place, just like Muslims ask people to take their shoes off before they go into a mosque. It doesn't mean you're a Muslim if you take your shoes off. It doesn't mean you're Jewish if you put a kippah, head covering on when you go into a synagogue. It's just how you show respect for the place. That's what the kippah is for. Many Jews wear a kippah all day long just to show reverence throughout their life. I started wearing one about the time I went to law school, and I found that by wearing one, at least in public, at least most of the time, that reminded me to try and behave in public, right? Because wearing a kippah is definitely a sign of being Jewish and being religious. And I feel like I'm now representing the Jewish people in public. So I try my best to behave and be nice and kind and thoughtful. And, you know, it's not a bad thing to do, generally, to be kind and thoughtful. And so it encourages that in my behavior as well. So, but you don't need to wear a kippah all the time. People typically wear a kippah in a synagogue or when they're doing a religious act. If they're saying a blessing or they're doing some other religious act, they will wear a kippah. A talit is the prayer shawl. It's a four-cornered garment that has tzitzit, fringes on the four corners. This was originally a man's obligation and not a woman's. In our movement, we're egalitarian, so women can wear a talit if they would like. I like to encourage women to wear a talit. It comes from that third passage in the Shema that I talked about from the book of Numbers that says you should put fringes on the corners of your garments to remind yourself of God's commandments. Typically a child, in the Orthodox world, boys, not girls, but boys, would wear an undergarment that has four, like a t-shirt that's cut up the side, that has four corners, and they put fringes on that t-shirt and then wear a shirt over it. So you'll see the strings hanging out from under their shirt sometimes. But you don't wear the prayer shawl, the one that goes over on the outside, the one that's decorative, until you are 13 years old in the Orthodox world. Some Orthodox Jews have the custom of not wearing a talit until the boys are married, until they're men and they're married. But certainly not until they are bar mitzvah, the age of commanded. And for that reason, I recommend people who are studying Judaism and want to become Jewish not to wear a talit until they actually convert. So this would be something you'd wear upon conversion, because now you'd be commanded to wear the fringes. And just like a child at 13 is commanded, would wear a talit. So not to wear fringes until the conversion ceremony. And that would be a sign of your being now a responsible member of the community. And tefillin are little leather boxes that have certain passages from the Torah written on parchment and rolled up and stuffed inside the boxes. And it comes from this passage, again, in the Shema that says, you should bind them as a symbol on your arm and they should be a symbol before your eyes. So we took that literally and put those passages, wrote the passages down, stuffed them in a box, and put them before our eyes on our forehead and wrapped them on our arms, fastened them on our arms. The symbolism there is that our arms, of course, our hands are how we act in the world, how we behave in the world. So with all our actions, we should remember that there's one God and we should love God and take care of the planet and his creatures. And we should also keep it in the forefront of our thoughts by putting it on our forehead, so that in our thoughts and in our deeds, we are constantly reminded that there's one God who wants us to behave in the world. And that's what the tefillin do. Tefillin are typically worn only during the morning service during the weekdays. They are not worn on Shabbat or festivals, on the Sabbath and festivals. A talit is typically also worn only during the morning service, but is also worn on the Sabbath and festivals. And the last thing I want to mention here is the Mezuzah, which again takes this passage from the Shema, and we write it on the parchment. And because another verse in that passage says you should fasten them to the doorposts of your house. So we write it out on a piece of parchment, stick it in a fancy box, and then stick it on the right side of the doorpost of the house, the entrance to the house. And that's called a mezuzah. So we took that passage very literally and did all of those things. I would say a mezuzah also is something you would put up after you formally convert to Judaism. You're commanded and now put it up, and that would mark your house now as a Jewish house, right? So wait till you become formally Jewish, and then you would put it up. Any Jewish person knows that when they see a mezuzah on the doorpost of a house, it's a Jewish house. Now, other people may not know exactly what that thing is doing there, but Jewish people would recognize a mezuzah right away and say, oh, this must be Jewish people living here. There are several service opportunities at Beth Yeshurun for public prayer. Even during this COVID season, we have 2 live stream services, at least on Shabbat. One is with our cantor Finkelstein, with musical accompaniment. We added musical accompaniment now in our services. And we have a sermon by one of our rabbis. And then we have a second service, which is the more traditional chapel service, which does not have musical accompaniment. And anybody with a decent voice can lead the service. They don't have a cantor. And that's live streamed. And then, as Liz Vincent said at the beginning of this class, we have a museum minyan service, which is a Zoom service, so you can see everybody. It's a really nice service. I really recommend at least trying it out while we're on Zoom, and then when we come back to the building to try it out in person, just to get to know who they are. And if it's not your cup of tea, that's fine too, but at least you get to try it out. So at Beth Asheron, because we are a large synagogue and we want to have people have different kind of worship opportunities, we provide these different opportunities, and you can find whichever one you like that suits your needs. Okay, so now let's go. I'm going to end this screen sharing and see if there's, are women required to wear a shmata when we pray? Right, okay, so in the Orthodox world, the tradition was that women who are married have to cover their hair, kind of like it's a sign, that is a sign of modesty, sort of like having long sleeves and skirts that go below your knees. Another thing you would do is cover your hair. Your hair was considered attractive to men. And by the way, it's all about men. Men are snowflakes. Men are fragile. We have to be sensitive to men's problems. And we don't want men to be distracted while they're trying to pray. So women are supposed to cover their hair. I hope I'm not trying to be too pejorative about that, but that is the general. So women in Orthodox circles typically cover their hair either with a cloth covering, or sometimes they wear a wig, or sometimes they wear a hat. And often it can be very stylishly done and look very decorative and attractive anyway. That's what they do in Orthodox circles. In Beth Yeshurun, women do not have to cover their hair. Women also do not have to wear a kippah. That was typically a man's thing. Covering your head as a sign of reverence was in the Middle East a man's thing. Our movement is egalitarian, and therefore we, I would say, I encourage women to wear a kippah, a head covering, as a sign of reverence, right? The same way a man would wear a kippah. And nowadays there are artists out there who are making very beautiful, sort of feminine looking kippahs that only women would wear. Well, not only women, but are designed for women to wear, let's say. But you can also wear a man's kippah if you would like. I would encourage women to wear a head covering anyway. Kneecaps are too sexy. Yes, they are, right? That's why women are supposed to wear skirts that go below their knees. It's all about the men and their problems, right? So if you go to an Orthodox synagogue, for instance, men and women sit separately, And there's what's called a mechitza, a divider that separates the women's section from the men's section. And again, that's because the men are too easily distracted by women. So we want them to be kind of off to the side where the men won't be distracted by them. Our movement, again, decided that men and women can sit together. One of the things about this social, it's kind of a social issue, right? If you're not used to seeing women, if men are not used to seeing women, then men could be more easily distracted by seeing women. So if you keep them segregated, that sort of encourages that mental outlook. Whereas if men and women are integrated all the time, it becomes less of a distraction, I think. Not entirely, but somewhat less. Yeah, no open-toed shoes. Well, that depends. Yeah, some people, I don't know. Okay, any other questions for me? Okay, so if there's no other questions, we're going to take a few-minute break. My wife is doing the adult B'nai Mitzvah Hebrew class right now, and then she's going to take a couple-minute break to switch over to the other, to your class, to this class, and she's going to zoom into this room, so you don't have to go anywhere. She's going to zoom into this room in a few minutes, and I'm going to zoom out of this room and zoom into the other room. We're switching places. Any other questions for me before I go?
Thank you so much, Rabbi Morgan.
Thank you, Rabbi.
You're very welcome. Diane is now in the room, and I think I should probably make her a co-host. Oh, where's Diane? I lost her.
I'm here.
Hold on one second. I'm almost there.
Oh, there you are. Okay.
Steve,
There.
I closed the other meeting by mistake, so now Jennifer's reopening.
Oh, oops. Okay. All right. So you're now a co-host, and I'm going to leave this one. Okay. Bye, everybody.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you so
Thank
much,
you.
Rabbi Morgan.
Thanks.
Thank you, Rabbi. Bye.
You're all welcome.